April 12, 1945, Schwarzburg, Thuringia. The small German town nestled in the verdant hills lay in partial ruins, its citizens huddled in basements and makeshift shelters as the thunder of distant artillery announced the imminent arrival of American forces. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had warned them for years about the savage Negro troops in the American army, rapists and murderers who would pillage, defile, and destroy everything German. In less than 24 hours, the townspeople would learn how catastrophically wrong those warnings had been. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a desperate population, indoctrinated by years of racial propaganda, had their worldview shattered not by bombs, but by chocolate bars and Coca-Cola, and how the most feared American soldiers became the most beloved. Frau Helga Müller pulled the thin blanket tighter around her 3 children as they huddled in the damp cellar beneath what remained of their bakery. The once prosperous family business had been reduced to rubble during a bombing raid 2 months earlier. Her husband Klaus had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch civilian militia created to defend the Reich. She had received no word from him in weeks and feared the worst. "Mama, I'm so hungry," whispered 8-year-old Emma, the youngest of her children. Beside her sat 10-year-old Friedrich and 12-year-old Greta, both too weak from hunger to even complain anymore. "I know, mein Schatz," Helga replied, smoothing Emma's dirty blonde hair. "Tomorrow I will try to find something. Perhaps Herr Weber still has some potatoes." But Helga knew this was a hollow promise. Food had become increasingly scarce in Schwarzburg, as it had throughout Germany. The winter of 1944-1945 had been brutal. Official rations had dwindled to less than 1,000 calories per day, and even those meager allotments were often unavailable. The children had lost alarming amounts of weight, their once rosy cheeks now hollow, their clothes hanging off diminished frames. 2 miles outside of town, Staff Sergeant DeAndre Jackson of the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, observed Schwarzburg through binoculars. The 761st was an all-black unit that had fought its way across Europe since landing in France in October 1944. Despite facing discrimination within the army itself, black soldiers served in segregated units under mostly white officers. The 761st had compiled an impressive combat record, participating in the Battle of the Bulge and breaking through the Siegfried Line. "What do you see, Jackson?" asked First Lieutenant James Munro, the white commanding officer of Jackson's platoon. "Small town, sir. Some damage from air raids. No obvious defenses. Looks pretty quiet. Any white flags? Signs of surrender?" "None that I can see, sir, but there's not much movement." Munro nodded, consulting his map. "Intelligence says most of the Wehrmacht pulled out 3 days ago. Might be some Volkssturm left, old men and boys with Panzerfausts. We'll approach cautiously." Staff Sergeant Jackson returned to his tank, the Brown Sugar, where his crew waited. Corporal Isaiah Washington, his gunner, was cleaning the 75mm gun. Private First Class Elijah Carter, the loader, was organizing shells. Private Marcus Green, the assistant driver and radio operator, was sharing a cigarette with Private Walter Hill, the driver. "Orders, Sarge?" asked Washington. "We're moving in at 600, Jackson replied. "Lieutenant thinks it might be a soft target, but stay sharp." "Another town, another bunch of scared Germans," said Carter, a tall, lanky man from Chicago. "Wonder if they'll run or fight." "Either way, they'll be surprised to see us." Green laughed, his Georgia accent still thick despite 3 years in the army. "Their propaganda says we've got tails and horns." Private Hill, the youngest at 19, frowned. "My brother's unit liberated a town last month, said the Germans were terrified of the colored troops at first, wouldn't even look them in the eye." Jackson nodded. "That's what Goebbels has been feeding them, that we're savages, rapists, barely human." After what we saw at that camp last week, Washington said quietly, "I'm not much concerned about their feelings." They all fell silent, remembering the horrors they had witnessed at the concentration camp they had helped liberate just days earlier. The emaciated prisoners, the mass graves, the stench of death that clung to their uniforms for days afterward. "We follow orders," Jackson said firmly. "We're American soldiers. We act like it." Meanwhile, in the town hall of Schwarzburg, Bürgermeister Friedrich Werner was meeting with what remained of the town leadership. At 62, Werner had been mayor for nearly 15 years. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, not out of ideological conviction, but because it seemed necessary for his position. "The Americans will be here by morning," he announced to the small gathering of elderly men and a few women who made up the emergency committee. "Our duty is to ensure the survival of our town and its citizens." "Should we fight?" asked retired Colonel Heinrich Brandt, who had been put in charge of the local Volkssturm. "We have perhaps 40 men, mostly boys and pensioners, a few Panzerfausts, some rifles." Werner shook his head. "To what end? To die uselessly? To have our town completely destroyed in the crossfire?" "So we surrender like cowards?" Brandt demanded, his weathered face flushing with anger. "We surrender like sensible people who don't want to see children die for a war that is already lost," Werner countered. "The Wehrmacht has abandoned us. Berlin has abandoned us. The Führer—" He paused, glancing around cautiously. "The Führer is hiding in his bunker while Germany burns." Frau Margarete Schultz, the town's schoolteacher, spoke up. "What about the colored American soldiers? The reports say they're animals, that they—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her implication clear. "Propaganda," Werner said, though without much conviction. "We've been fed nothing but propaganda for years." "Even so," said Dr. Otto Lehmann, the town's elderly physician, "perhaps the women and children should hide when they arrive, just as a precaution." Werner sighed heavily. "Do what you must, but I will meet them with a white flag. This war has taken enough from Schwarzburg." As the meeting disbanded, Werner remained at his desk, composing a letter of surrender. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote. He had spent his entire life in Schwarzburg, watched it transform under the Nazi regime, seen the initial prosperity give way to the harsh realities of war. Now he would be the man who surrendered it to the Americans, to black American soldiers, no less. History, he thought bitterly, had a cruel sense of irony. That night, few in Schwarzburg slept. The sound of distant artillery served as a constant reminder of what morning would bring. Parents whispered to children, husbands to wives, all wondering whether the stories they had been told about the approaching Americans, especially the black soldiers, were true. In the Müller cellar, little Emma woke crying from a nightmare. "The monsters are coming, Mama," she sobbed as Helga held her. "The black monsters from the pictures." Helga thought of the propaganda posters that had decorated Schwarzburg for years, depicting black American soldiers as ape-like creatures attacking German women. She had never questioned these images before. Now, with the Americans at their doorstep, she found herself hoping desperately that they were lies. "They're just men." "Emma," she said, not knowing if she believed it herself. "Just soldiers, like Papa?" Friedrich asked, awake now too. Helga swallowed hard. "Yes," she said, "like Papa." At 600 hours exactly, the tanks of the 761st Battalion began their approach to Schwarzburg. They moved slowly, cautiously, prepared for resistance that never came. Instead, as they reached the town limits, they were met by Mayor Werner, standing alone with a white bedsheet tied to a broomstick. Lieutenant Monroe ordered the column to halt and emerged from his command vehicle. He approached Werner warily, his hand on his sidearm. "I am Bürgermeister Friedrich Werner," the older man said in halting English. "Schwarzburg surrenders unconditionally." Monroe nodded, his expression neutral. "I'm Lieutenant James Monroe, United States Army. Where are your defending forces?" "Gone. Wehrmacht left days ago. We have only old men and boys, no resistance." Monroe studied the man before turning to signal to his men. "Sergeant Jackson, secure the town square. Washington, Carter, check the buildings along the main road, standard procedure." The black soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, their weapons ready, but not aimed directly at the civilians who began to emerge cautiously from their homes. The fear on the German faces was palpable, especially when confronted with the black GIs. Some women pulled children behind them, others averted their eyes. A few made furtive signs of the cross. Staff Sergeant Jackson noticed this reaction, but maintained his professional demeanor. He had seen it before in other German towns, the initial shock, the barely concealed terror. Sometimes it gave him a grim satisfaction, let them be afraid after what their country had done, but mostly it just reminded him of the similar looks he sometimes received back home in Alabama. As the Americans secured the town, more details of Schwartzberg's condition became apparent. The civilians were malnourished, many on the verge of starvation. Their clothing was patched and worn. Buildings showed damage from Allied bombing raids. It was a far cry from the prosperous, powerful Germany they had been fighting against. These people are starving. Jackson reported to Lieutenant Monroe after the initial sweep. Lots of kids, mostly women, elderly. They're scared to death of us, especially my men. Monroe nodded, looking around at the town square. Set up an aid station. We've got rations to spare. Let's get some food distributed. Sir? Jackson questioned, surprised by the order. You heard me, Sergeant. These people aren't soldiers anymore. They're civilians under our protection now, Geneva Convention. Plus, feeding hungry kids is just the right thing to do. Jackson nodded. Yes, sir. Within an hour, an aid station had been established in the town square. The GIs brought out their rations, canned goods, chocolate bars, powdered milk, and other supplies. Word spread quickly through Schwartzberg, but the civilians approached cautiously, especially the women and children. In the Müller cellar, Helga heard neighbors whispering about food being distributed by the Americans. Mama, can we go? Friedrich asked, his hollow eyes brightening at the prospect of food. Helga hesitated. I don't know if it's safe. Frau Beck says they're giving chocolate to the children, Greta added. Real chocolate, Mama. The thought of her children continuing to starve while food was available nearby made Helga's decision for her. We'll go together, she said. Stay close to me. They emerged from the cellar, blinking in the morning light. The street was eerily quiet, though Helga could hear activity from the direction of the town square. Taking a deep breath, she took Emma's hand in her right, Friedrich's in her left, and nodded for Greta to follow. As they approached the square, Helga's steps slowed. She could see the American tanks, intimidating and massive, and there were the soldiers, tall, uniformed figures moving about efficiently. Many of them were black, their dark skin a stark contrast to the white Germans they were interacting with. Emma squeezed her hand tightly. Are those the monsters, Mama? Before Helga could answer, one of the black soldiers turned toward them. It was Staff Sergeant Jackson, who had been overseeing the distribution of rations. He noticed the frightened family and the thin, hungry-looking children. His expression softened. It's okay, he said in English, knowing they probably wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. We've got food for the kids. Helga froze, instinctively pulling her children closer. Jackson recognized the fear in her eyes. He had seen it too many times not to. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 Hershey's chocolate bars. He knelt down to be at eye level with the children and held out the chocolate with a gentle smile. The children looked to their mother uncertainly. Helga remained rooted to the spot, torn between fear and her children's desperate need for food. Jackson broke off a small piece of one chocolate bar and ate it himself, then offered it again with a nod of encouragement. It was a gesture he had used before, showing that the food wasn't poisoned or dangerous. Friedrich, always the bravest, was the first to step forward. He reached out tentatively and took one of the chocolate bars. The American soldier smiled and nodded encouragingly. Friedrich unwrapped it carefully, broke off a small piece and put it in his mouth. His eyes widened. Mama, it's so sweet, he said in German, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in weeks. Seeing their brother's reaction, Emma and Greta stepped forward as well, each accepting a chocolate bar from the black soldier. Helga watched in disbelief as this man, whom propaganda had portrayed as a monster, treated her children with such gentle kindness. Danke, she said softly. Thank you. Jackson nodded, understanding the universal expression of gratitude. You're welcome, Ma'am, he replied. He gestured toward the aid station. There's more food over there. Milk for the kids. Though she didn't understand his words, Helga grasped his meaning from his gestures. Cautiously, she allowed him to lead her family to the aid station, where other GIs were distributing more substantial rations. Similar scenes were playing out across the square, as Schwartzberg's residents cautiously approached the American soldiers. The initial terror began to give way to desperate gratitude as food was distributed to the hungry population. Private Hill was handing out powdered milk when he noticed an elderly German woman staring at him intently. Self-conscious, he offered her a packet of the milk. "For your grandkids, Mum?" he asked with a polite smile. To his surprise, the woman reached out and touched his face gently, tears in her eyes. "Mensch," she said softly. "Nur ein Mensch." Just a human. Hill stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this unexpected gesture. The woman took the milk with a trembling danke and walked away, leaving Hill profoundly moved by the brief interaction. By midday, the atmosphere in Schwarzburg had transformed. The fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had been tempered by the reality that contradicted years of propaganda. The American soldiers, black and white alike, were not the monsters they had been told to expect. They were men, disciplined and professional, who gave food to hungry children and medical attention to the sick. The breakthrough moment came when Corporal Washington noticed several children staring longingly at the bottles of Coca-Cola that some of the soldiers were drinking. With a grin, he opened his rucksack and pulled out several bottles he had been saving. "Anyone want to try some American soda?" he called out, opening the bottles with a church key. The children approached cautiously, but their curiosity overcame their fear. Washington poured small amounts into tin cups and distributed them. The children's reactions to their first taste of Coca-Cola, the wide eyes, the surprised laughter at the carbonation, drew genuine amusement from the soldiers. One little boy burped loudly after his first sip, then covered his mouth in embarrassment as everyone laughed. It was a moment of simple, shared humanity amid the ruins of war. For Helga Müller, watching her children smile and laugh as they drank the strange American beverage, something shifted in her worldview. These men, these black men whom she had been taught to fear, had brought joy back to her children's lives with simple acts of kindness. When Emma approached Staff Sergeant Jackson with her empty cup held out, asking in German for more, please, and he smiled and refilled it, Helga felt tears welling in her eyes. The contrast between what she had been told to expect and what she was witnessing was overwhelming. She wasn't alone. Throughout the square, German mothers watched in disbelief as the American soldiers, particularly the black GIs they had been taught to fear most, treated their children with kindness and gentle humor. Many, like Helga, found themselves fighting back tears. By afternoon, Lieutenant Monroe had established his command post in the town hall with Mayor Werner's cooperation. The town was now officially under American military governance, though the day-to-day administration would remain largely in German hands under American supervision. "Your people seem surprised by our black soldiers," Monroe commented to Werner as they discussed arrangements for the town. Werner hesitated before responding. "We were told many things about American Negro troops. Terrible things. Propaganda," Monroe said flatly. "Yes," Werner agreed, looking out the window at the town square where German children were now playing a makeshift game of baseball with several black GIs. It seemed so. While the situation in the town square had transformed into something approaching normalcy, tensions remained below the surface. Not everyone in Schwarzburg welcomed the American presence, regardless of how they treated the population. In a house near the edge of town, Colonel Brandt met secretly with a small group of die-hard Nazi loyalists, mostly teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, and a few older men who had evaded the American patrols. "This is temporary," he told them in a harsh whisper. "The Americans cannot be trusted, especially the Negro soldiers. Their kindness is a trick. The Führer will send reinforcements soon." "But the war is lost," argued 16-year-old Hans Weber. "Everyone knows it. And the Americans have been decent. They're feeding people." "Feeding them what? American poison that will make our German children soft and weak," Brandt spat. "And when night falls, you'll see the true nature of these animals. They'll take our women, mark my words." The others shifted uncomfortably, torn between the lifelong indoctrination that told them to resist and the evidence of their own eyes that suggested the Americans, even the black soldiers, were not the monsters they had been led to believe. "What would you have us do?" asked Otto Schmidt, a grizzled veteran of the First World War. "Fight with our few Panzerfausts against their tanks. Die uselessly." Better to die a German than live as an American slave, Brandt replied. But no, I don't suggest open battle. Not yet. We watch. We wait. And perhaps, if the opportunity presents itself, we make a statement. Show them that not all of Schwarzburg surrenders so easily. As the meeting disbanded, young Hans lingered behind. "Colonel," he said hesitantly, "my sister has a fever. The American doctor, a Negro doctor, gave her medicine today. She's better already. Why would he help her if they're our enemies?" Brandt's face darkened. "Go home, boy. You're too young to understand the complexities of war." As Hans left, Brandt remained alone, his hands clenched in frustration. The world he had believed in was crumbling, and he couldn't accept it. Back in the town square, the distribution of food continued throughout the day. The Americans had brought out field kitchens and were preparing a more substantial meal for the townspeople. The smell of cooking meat, a rarity in Schwarzburg for months, drew even more residents from their homes. Corporal Washington and Private Carter had been put in charge of one of the field kitchens, cooking up what the GIs jokingly called army goulash, a mixture of canned meat, vegetables, and whatever else was available. Despite the humble ingredients, to the hungry Germans, it smelled like a feast. "Never thought I'd see the day when Germans would be lining up for food cooked by a couple of colored boys from the South," Carter remarked as he stirred the large pot. "My grandmother always said, the quickest way to change someone's mind is through their stomach," Washington replied with a chuckle. "Back home, even the most prejudiced white folks would eat my mama's peach cobbler when offered." Among those lining up for food was Helga Müller with her 3 children. The initial shock of interacting with the black soldiers had worn off, replaced by a cautious acceptance born of necessity and their unexpectedly kind treatment. As Washington filled their bowls with the hot stew, he noticed Friedrich staring at his uniform insignia. "You like tanks, kid?" Washington asked, pointing to the distinctive patch of the 761st Tank Battalion. Friedrich nodded, understanding the gesture if not the words. Washington smiled and pulled a small item from his pocket, a miniature metal tank, a good luck charm he had carried throughout the campaign. He held it out to the boy. Friedrich looked to his mother for permission. When Helga nodded, he accepted the gift with wide eyes. "Danke," he said softly, examining the tiny tank with wonder. "Tell him it's from the Black Panthers," Washington told Helga, pointing to his unit patch and then to his skin, hoping she would understand the connection. Helga didn't completely grasp his meaning, but she recognized it as a moment of connection across the gulf that separated them, not just as former enemies, but as people from entirely different worlds whose paths would never have crossed except for the war. As the afternoon progressed, more American troops arrived in Schwarzburg, including a medical detachment. Captain Michael Reynolds, a young doctor from Boston, quickly set up a clinic in what had been the town's small hospital before it was damaged in a bombing raid. Among the medics assisting him was Private First Class Samuel Jenkins, one of the few black medics in the unit. Despite having completed medical school at Howard University, Jenkins served as a medic rather than a doctor due to the Army's racial policies. Nevertheless, he approached his duties with the professionalism and skill of the physician he was trained to be. Word spread quickly through Schwarzburg that the Americans were offering medical care. Dr. Lehman, the town's elderly physician who had been operating with dwindling supplies and overwhelming need for months, made his way to the hospital to meet his American counterparts. "I am Dr. Otto Lehman," he introduced himself to Captain Reynolds. "I am grateful for your assistance. Our medical situation has been desperate." Reynolds shook the German doctor's hand. "Captain Michael Reynolds, this is Private Jenkins, one of our best medics." Dr. Lehman hesitated almost imperceptibly before extending his hand to Jenkins as well. "You are a doctor?" he asked, noting the skilled way Jenkins was organizing the medical supplies. "Medic," Jenkins corrected, though Reynolds interjected. "Jenkins has a medical degree from Howard University, one of the finest students in his class, from what I hear." Lehman looked confused. "But then why—" "It's complicated," Jenkins said with a tight smile, cutting off the question about why a trained physician would serve as a medic. "I'm here to help, Doctor. That's what matters." Lehman nodded slowly, beginning to understand some of the complexities of American society that had never been part of the Nazi propaganda about their enemies. "Yes," he agreed. That is what matters. We have many in need of care. Throughout the afternoon, German patients began arriving at the makeshift clinic. Many were suffering from malnutrition and related conditions. Others had injuries or illnesses that had gone untreated due to the lack of medical supplies. Jenkins found himself treating an elderly German woman with an infected wound on her leg. As he cleaned the wound with gentle efficiency, the woman watched him with a mixture of curiosity and lingering apprehension. "American?" she asked in heavily accented English. Jenkins nodded. "Yes, ma'am. From Philadelphia." She didn't understand his response, but seemed reassured by his gentle manner. "Schwarzer Arzt," she murmured to herself. "Black doctor." "That's right," Jenkins replied, understanding the German words. "Schwarzer Arzt. First one you've met, I bet." The woman studied his face as he continued treating her wound. "Danke," she said finally. "Thank you." "You're welcome, ma'am," Jenkins replied, finishing the bandage. "Keep it clean and come back in 2 days." Dr. Lehmann, who had been observing, translated Jenkins' instructions. The woman nodded and left, looking back once at the black medic with an expression that had transformed from fear to something approaching respect. "Your people are surprised that a black man can be a doctor," Jenkins commented to Lehmann after the woman had gone. Lehmann hesitated. "They have been told that men like you are primitive, incapable of such work." "And what do you think, Doctor?" Jenkins asked directly. Lehmann met his gaze. "I think propaganda is a powerful weapon, but truth is more powerful still. Your skill speaks for itself." By evening, the Americans had established a secure perimeter around Schwartzberg and set up temporary housing in the less damaged buildings. The initial distribution of food had been completed, with arrangements made for ongoing rations in the days to come. Lieutenant Munro gathered his NCOs, including Staff Sergeant Jackson, for a briefing in the town hall. "We'll be here for at least a week," Munro informed them. "Division is still moving east toward Leipzig. We're to secure this area, ensure the civilian population is stable, and keep an eye out for any Wehrmacht stragglers or SS units that might still be operating." "What about the civilians, sir?" Jackson asked. "They're in pretty bad shape. Food, medicine, basic supplies. They're short on everything." Munro nodded. "Command is aware. Supply trucks will be coming through tomorrow. In the meantime, we'll continue sharing our rations as needed, especially with the children and the sick." "Sir," Private Hill spoke up hesitantly, "some of the men have been giving their personal rations to the German kids. Chocolate, gum, that sort of thing." "Is that going to be a problem, Private?" Munro asked, his expression neutral. Hill straightened. "No, sir, just wanted to report it." Munro's expression softened slightly. "We're soldiers, not monsters. Helping hungry kids isn't against regulations. Just make sure essential supplies are accounted for." As the meeting concluded, Jackson remained behind. "Sir, there's something else. The German civilians. They were clearly terrified of the black troops initially. That seems to be changing, but I thought you should know." Munro sighed. "I'm aware, Sergeant. Nazi propaganda about black American soldiers was extensive. They depicted you as savages, criminals, not even fully human." "Not so different from back home in some places," Jackson commented dryly. Munro acknowledged this with a grim nod. "The best response is what you're already doing. Professional conduct, by-the-book operations. Let them see the reality instead of the propaganda." "Yes, sir," Jackson replied. "Though I have to admit, seeing their faces when they realize we're just men doing a job, there's some satisfaction in that." As night fell over Schwartzberg, the town settled into an uneasy quiet. American guards were posted throughout, maintaining security while the majority of troops rested. The Germans remained mostly in their homes, processing the dramatic change in their circumstances and the unexpected nature of their American occupiers. In the small apartment above what had once been her bakery, Helga Müller tucked her children into bed. For the first time in months, they had gone to sleep with full stomachs. Friedrich kept the small metal tank the black soldier had given him clutched in his hand as he drifted off to sleep. "Mama," Greta asked quietly, "why did they tell us the Americans were monsters? Especially the black ones. They gave us food. They were nice. Helga sat on the edge of the bed, considering how to answer. Sometimes, she said finally, people tell lies about those who are different to make us afraid. Fear is a powerful weapon in war. Like when Herr Lehmann's shop was broken because he was Jewish, Greta persisted, referring to the events of Kristallnacht years earlier, which she barely remembered but had heard discussed. Helga stiffened. Such questions had become dangerous under the Nazi regime, and the habit of caution was deeply ingrained. But the Nazis were gone now, and the Americans were here. Perhaps it was finally safe to speak the truth. "Yes," she said softly, "like that. Now sleep, children. Tomorrow will be another long day." As she left their room, Helga caught sight of her reflection in a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. She barely recognized the gaunt, weary woman who stared back at her. The war had taken so much: her husband, her livelihood, her security. But perhaps, she thought, as she recalled the unexpected kindness of the American soldiers, it had also taken something else. The comfortable lies she had lived with for too long. Elsewhere in Schwarzburg, not everyone was adjusting so philosophically to the American presence. Colonel Brandt sat in his darkened living room, a glass of schnapps in his trembling hand, listening to the occasional sound of American patrols passing by his house. He had spent his entire adult life in service to Germany, fought in the Great War, suffered through the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty and the economic collapse that followed, then welcomed the rise of the Nazi Party as Germany's salvation. He had believed in the 1,000-year Reich with unwavering faith. Now, American tanks sat in the town square. Black American soldiers gave chocolate to German children. And everyone, his neighbors, the mayor, even his fellow veterans, seemed ready to accept defeat, to acknowledge that everything they had fought for was built on lies. "Traitors," he muttered into his schnapps. "Cowards." A soft knock at his door startled him. Cautiously, he approached and called out, "Who's there?" "It's Hans, Colonel Hans Weber." Brandt opened the door to admit the teenager, glancing quickly up and down the street to ensure no American patrols were nearby. "What is it, boy?" "It's dangerous to be out after curfew." Hans looked troubled, his young face reflecting the conflict that many in Schwarzburg were experiencing. "The others won't help us," he said. "Schmidt, Müller, all of them, they say it's over, that we should accept the occupation and be grateful the Americans are feeding us." Brandt's face hardened. Weak men. They never truly believed. "What do we do now?" Hans asked. The older man studied the boy's face in the dim light. So young, so earnest, the perfect product of the Hitler youth, raised to believe in German superiority and destiny, now standing amid the ashes of those beliefs. "We wait," Brandt said finally. "We observe. And when the moment is right, we remind these Americans, especially the black ones, that not all Germans surrender so easily." Hans nodded, though doubt flickered across his features. "My sister is better," he said abruptly. "The medicine the black medic gave her broke her fever." Brandt waved this away impatiently. "A coincidence. She would have recovered anyway. The children in the square today—" "Enough," Brandt snapped. "Go home, Hans. We'll speak again when you've remembered your duty to the fatherland." After the boy left, Brandt returned to his schnapps, his thoughts dark. The boy was wavering, just like the others, swayed by a few chocolate bars and medical supplies. Had the German spirit become so weak, or had it all been a lie from the beginning? He couldn't allow himself to consider the latter possibility, not after everything he had sacrificed, everything he had believed. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Schwarzburg. As promised, American supply trucks arrived, bringing additional food, medicine, and essential items for distribution to the civilian population. The town square was transformed into an organized aid center, with stations for food, medical care, and other necessities. Staff Sergeant Jackson and his tank crew were assigned to security for the distribution center. As they took up their positions, they noticed a significant change from the previous day. The German civilians, while still cautious, approached them with far less fear. Some even offered tentative smiles or nods of greeting. "Quite a difference from yesterday," Washington observed, as he watched a group of German children playing nearby, occasionally glancing at the American soldiers with curiosity rather than terror. "Amazing what a little food and basic human decency can accomplish," Jackson replied, "though I'm not naive enough to think they've all suddenly stopped believing what they've been taught about us." "Still feels good, though," Washington said, "being seen as a man first, rather than just a color." Private Hill, who had grown up in the deeply segregated South, nodded in agreement. Ironic that we had to come all the way to Germany to get that experience. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Helga Müller and her children. Friedrich, spotting Corporal Washington, approached with a shy smile, the small metal tank clutched in his hand. "Guten Morgen," the boy said carefully. Washington grinned. "Good morning to you too, little man. I see you kept that tank safe." Friedrich nodded enthusiastically, though he didn't understand the words. He held up the tank, then pointed to the real Sherman tank parked nearby with a questioning look. Washington chuckled, understanding the boy's curiosity. "You want to see the real thing up close?" He looked to Helga for permission. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Come on then," Washington said, gesturing for Friedrich to follow. With his mother and siblings watching nervously, Washington led the boy to the tank and lifted him up to peer into the open turret. Friedrich's eyes widened with wonder as he looked inside the complicated interior of the Sherman. Washington pointed out various features: the gun breech, the controls, the cramped positions for each crew member. "This here's where I sit," he explained, pointing to the gunner's position. "And over there is where Sergeant Jackson commands the whole thing." Though Friedrich couldn't understand the specific words, his face reflected his fascination with the war machine and the men who operated it. When Washington set him back down, Friedrich looked up at the tall black soldier with undisguised admiration. "Danke," he said earnestly. "You're welcome, kid," Washington replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "Maybe someday you'll grow up to build machines instead of weapons, yeah? Better use of talent." As Friedrich returned to his family, bubbling with excitement about what he had seen, Helga approached Washington. "Thank you," she said in halting English. Happy. First time, long time." Washington nodded, understanding her meaning if not her exact words. "Kids should be happy, Mum. War ain't their fault." Across the square, Private Jenkins was assisting at the medical station that had been set up. A line of Germans with various ailments waited patiently for treatment. Many were suffering from conditions related to malnutrition and the harsh living conditions of the final war years. An elderly man with a persistent cough was next in line. When he saw that Jenkins would be treating him, he hesitated visibly. "Nein," he said, shaking his head. "Nicht der Schwarze," not the black one. Dr. Lehmann, who was working alongside the Americans, overheard this and approached. "Herr Fischer," he said firmly, "Private Jenkins is a trained physician. He will treat you properly." "A Negro doctor?" Fischer scoffed. "Impossible." "I have seen his work," Lehmann insisted. "He is skilled, more skilled than many German doctors I have known." Fischer remained resistant. "I will wait for a white doctor." Captain Reynolds, overhearing the exchange, stepped in. "Then you'll be waiting a long time, sir. Private Jenkins is the only medical personnel available at this station right now. Your choice is to accept his care or return home untreated." The German man looked from Reynolds to Jenkins to Lehmann, conflict evident on his face. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he nodded. As Jenkins began examining him, the tension was palpable. But as the examination progressed, and Jenkins demonstrated his knowledge and professionalism, Fischer's resistance began to soften. When Jenkins diagnosed his condition as bronchitis likely exacerbated by malnutrition and prescribed appropriate treatment, the older man's expression had transformed from suspicion to grudging respect. "You are really a doctor?" he asked in broken English as Jenkins prepared his medicine. "Yes, sir," Jenkins replied. "Graduated from Howard University Medical School." Fischer didn't fully understand, but he nodded slowly. "Danke," he said as he accepted the medication. "Thank you, doctor." Jenkins smiled slightly at the title that the army didn't recognize, but this German man now did. "You're welcome, sir. Take this twice daily and come back if the cough worsens." As the day progressed, more such interactions occurred throughout Schwarzburg. Individual encounters between the American soldiers, particularly the black GIs, and German civilians were gradually eroding years of propaganda and preconceptions on both sides. For the Americans, especially the black soldiers, there was a certain irony in the situation. They had come to fight against Nazi ideology, which held racial superiority at its core, while serving in a segregated army from a country that still enforced racial segregation through Jim Crow laws. "You ever think about how strange this all is?" Private Hill asked Private Green as they took a break from their duties. "Here we are, liberating these people from Nazis who thought they were the master race when back home. When back home, we're still second-class citizens," Green finished for him. "Yeah, I think about it. My daddy couldn't even vote in Georgia until he was 40 years old. And yet these Germans are starting to look at us like we're some kind of heroes," Hill mused, watching as a group of German children nearby played with a ball that one of the GIs had given them. "White folks back home would have a fit if they could see this." "That's the thing about war," Green replied. "It changes things, changes people. Maybe when we get back home things will be different too." Hill looked skeptical. "You really believe that?" Green shrugged. "I got to believe something better is coming after all this. Otherwise, what are we fighting for?" Meanwhile, Lieutenant Monroe was meeting again with Mayor Werner to discuss the ongoing administration of the town under American occupation. "Your troops have been disciplined," Werner acknowledged, "especially the Negro soldiers. The people were afraid, but now—" He gestured vaguely. "Now they see that our black soldiers are just men doing their duty," Monroe finished for him. "Good men, most of them. Better than many I know." Werner nodded slowly. "It is strange. For years we were told they were Untermenschen, subhuman, animals, but they share their food with our children. They treat our sick. It makes one wonder what other lies we were told." "Propaganda is a powerful weapon," Monroe said. "All countries use it, including mine. But the Nazis elevated it to an art form." "Yes," Werner agreed, his expression troubled, "and we believed it so easily." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Monroe moved quickly to the window to see several of his men restraining a German teenager, Hans Weber, who appeared to have been caught attempting to steal supplies from one of the American trucks. "Excuse me," Monroe said to Werner. "I need to address this." Outside, he found Staff Sergeant Jackson already on the scene. "What happened, Sergeant?" "Caught this kid trying to take medical supplies from the truck," Jackson reported. "Wasn't even being particularly sneaky about it." Hans stood defiant, despite being restrained by 2 American soldiers. He glared at Jackson with undisguised contempt. "What's your name, son?" Monroe asked the boy. Hans remained silent, his jaw clenched. Mayor Werner, who had followed Monroe outside, stepped forward. "His name is Hans Weber. His father was killed on the Eastern Front last year. He was in the Hitler Youth." Monroe nodded, understanding the context. "What were you trying to take, Hans?" Still the boy refused to speak. Private Jenkins approached from the medical station. "It was penicillin, sir, and some sulfur drugs." "For himself?" Monroe questioned. Jenkins shook his head. "Doubtful. He doesn't appear ill." "His mother is sick," a small voice interjected. They turned to see a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing nearby. "My brother was trying to help her." "Lisa!" Hans finally broke his silence. "Go home." "Is this true?" Monroe asked the girl. "Your mother is ill?" Lisa nodded, tears in her eyes. "She has been sick for many days. Hans said the American medicine could help her, but he was afraid to ask." Monroe looked from the girl to her brother, understanding dawning. "Why didn't you just ask for help?" he asked Hans directly. The boy's defiance cracked slightly. "Germans do not beg from our enemies," he said in accented English. "I see," Monroe replied, "and is stealing from your enemies more honorable?" Hans had no answer for this. Monroe made a quick decision. "Private Jenkins, go with these children to examine their mother. Take whatever medical supplies you need. Sergeant Jackson, release the boy." The soldiers restraining Hans let him go, though they remained alert for any sudden movements. The boy stood uncertainly, clearly surprised by this turn of events. "We're not your enemies anymore, Hans," Monroe told him firmly. "The war is effectively over. Now we're just people trying to help other people survive. Do you understand?" Hans looked from Monroe to Jenkins to his sister, conflict evident on his young face. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Go with Private Jenkins," Monroe instructed. "Help your mother." As Jenkins led the two children away, Monroe turned to Jackson. "Keep an eye on that situation, Sergeant. The boy's been thoroughly indoctrinated. It won't change overnight." "Yes, sir," Jackson acknowledged, "though I've seen stranger transformations in the past few days." By late afternoon, new developments brought additional complexity to the situation in Schwarzburg. A group of displaced persons, former forced laborers and concentration camp survivors who had been liberated by advancing Allied forces, arrived in the town, having been directed there by American units further east. The group of about 30 people included Poles, Russians, French, and a few Jews, who had somehow survived the camp system. They were in even worse condition than the German civilians, emaciated, ill, and bearing the visible scars of their ordeal. Their arrival created an immediate tension. Some Germans looked on with guilt or shame, others with continued hostility, while many simply avoided eye contact altogether. Lieutenant Monroe quickly organized accommodation for the newcomers in a school building that had sustained only minor damage. Food and medical care were prioritized for them, given their desperate condition. Staff Sergeant Jackson and his men were assigned to ensure the displaced person's security, as Monroe was concerned about potential conflicts with the local German population. "Keep a close eye on this situation, Sergeant," Monroe instructed. "Some of these people were literally enslaved in German factories or farms. There's bound to be some strong feelings on both sides." Jackson nodded grimly. "We'll make sure they're protected, sir." Among the displaced persons was a young Polish man named Tadeusz Kowalski, who had spent 3 years as a forced laborer in a German armaments factory. Though only 22, his experiences had aged him beyond his years. His once strong frame had been reduced to skin and bones, and his eyes held the haunted look common to many survivors. As Jackson helped organize the newcomers in their temporary quarters, he noticed Kowalski staring out the window at the German civilians receiving aid in the town square. "Something on your mind?" Jackson asked, approaching the young man. Kowalski turned, his expression bitter. "They receive food, medicine, kindness. Where was their kindness when we starved in their factories, when their overseers beat us for not working fast enough?" Jackson had no easy answer for this. "War brings out the worst in people," he said finally, "but it's over now. We're trying to help everyone who needs it." "Some deserve help more than others," Kowalski replied, his voice hardening as he watched German children playing nearby. "Maybe so," Jackson acknowledged, "but deciding who deserves what isn't my job. I'm just a soldier." Kowalski studied Jackson's face. "You are American, Negro, yet you fight for these Germans who called you Untermenschen, who believed they were a master race." "I fight for my country," Jackson corrected him. "And yeah, there's some irony there, considering how America treats its colored citizens. But the Nazis were worse. What they did to people like you, to the Jews, it had to be stopped." Kowalski nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Two men who had experienced different forms of the same prejudice. "Perhaps," Kowalski said after a moment, "if your black American soldiers had been the first Germans saw of the outside world, instead of Hitler's lies, things would have been different." "Perhaps," Jackson agreed, "but history doesn't work that way. We just have to deal with what is, not what might have been." As evening approached, another supply convoy arrived in Schwarzburg, this one bringing not just food and medicine, but also a more unexpected cargo, a mobile kitchen equipped to make hamburgers and a supply of Coca-Cola for the troops. The arrival of these iconic American foods created a buzz of excitement among the GIs, who had been subsisting on field rations for weeks. The smell of grilling meat soon filled the town square as cooks set up their operation. Word spread quickly through Schwarzburg about the strange American food being prepared. Many German civilians, especially children, gathered at a distance to watch the proceedings with curiosity. Private Hill, noticing the onlookers, approached Lieutenant Monroe. "Sir, we've got plenty to spare. Permission to offer some to the local kids?" Monroe considered for a moment, then nodded. "Good for morale. Theirs and ours. Make sure the displaced persons get served first, though." They need it most. Soon a remarkable scene unfolded in the town square of Schwartzburg. American soldiers, many of them black, were serving hamburgers and Coca-Cola to German children, many of whom were tasting these quintessentially American foods for the first time. The reactions were a mixture of caution and delight. Some children approached warily, still influenced by years of propaganda against American culture. Others came forward eagerly, hunger overcoming any lingering fears. Helga Miller watched as her children joined the line, Friedrich leading the way as usual. When they reached the front, they were served by Private Green, who placed a hamburger on a paper plate for each child with a friendly smile. "There you go, Kinder," he said, using one of the few German words he knew. Authentic American cuisine, such as it is. The children took their burgers to where Helga was standing and began to eat with expressions of wonder. The combination of meat, bread, and unfamiliar condiments was unlike anything they had tasted before. "It's so good, Mama," Emma exclaimed, sauce smeared around her mouth. "The black soldier made it for us." Helga smiled at her daughter's innocent statement, how quickly children adapted, how easily they discarded the prejudices adults had tried to instill in them. Just days ago, Emma had feared these same men as monsters from propaganda posters. Across the square, Hans Weber watched the scene with conflicted emotions. That morning, Private Jenkins had visited his home and treated his mother, whose condition had already begun to improve thanks to the American medicine. The black medic had been professional, kind and knowledgeable, nothing like the savage caricature from Nazi propaganda. Yet Hans still felt the pull of his earlier beliefs, the sense that accepting help from these former enemies, especially the black troops, was somehow a betrayal of Germany and all he had been taught to believe. Colonel Brandt appeared beside him, his face tight with disapproval as he observed the scene. "Look at them," he said bitterly, "buying German dignity with hamburgers and cola, and our people just accepting it like beggars." Hans shifted uncomfortably. "They're hungry, Colonel. The children haven't had meat in months." "And whose fault is that?" Brandt demanded. "The Americans bombed our supply lines, destroyed our farms. Now they play the saviors, and we're supposed to be grateful." Before Hans could respond, they noticed Private Jenkins approaching. The medic nodded to Hans. "Your mother's fever is completely gone," he reported. "The antibiotics worked. She'll need to finish the full course, but she should recover fully." Hans nodded stiffly. "Thank you." Jenkins glanced at Brandt, noting the older man's hostile expression, then back to Hans. "You're welcome to come get some food," he offered. "Plenty to go around." "We are not charity cases," Brandt snapped before Hans could reply. Jenkins met the older man's gaze steadily. "No, sir. You're human beings who need food, same as anyone else." After Jenkins walked away, Brandt turned to Hans. "You see how they try to humiliate us, treating us like children who should be grateful for their leftovers." Hans watched as Jenkins returned to helping distribute food to a group of displaced persons, his manner as respectful and professional with them as it had been with Hans's mother. "I don't think that's what they're doing," Hans said slowly. "I think they're just helping." Brandt's face darkened. "You too now. Has everyone in Schwartzburg lost their pride so quickly?" He stormed away, leaving Hans staring after him, then turning back to observe the scene in the town square. German children laughing as they tried to manage the unfamiliar hamburgers. American soldiers, black and white, serving food with easy smiles. Former enemies sharing a meal as the sun set over the war-torn town. Something was shifting in Schwartzburg, Hans realized, something fundamental that went beyond the simple fact of military defeat. As night fell and the food distribution concluded, a new development further highlighted the changing dynamics in the town. Several of the American soldiers produced musical instruments, a guitar, a harmonica, a small drum, and began playing jazz in the town square. The unfamiliar music drew curious onlookers. Jazz had been denounced as degenerate music by the Nazi regime, associated with black American culture and therefore deemed inferior. Few in Schwartzburg had ever heard it performed live. Private Marcus Green, who had played guitar in clubs back in Georgia before the war, led the impromptu band. His fingers moved skillfully over the strings as he played a blues number, his rich voice singing lyrics about heartbreak and perseverance that few of the Germans could understand, but many could feel. Staff Sergeant Jackson watched from nearby, a small smile on his face. "Been a while since I heard you play, Green," he commented during a break between songs. Green grinned. "Been a while since there was anything worth singing about, Sarge." The music continued, drawing more spectators. Among them were some of the displaced persons whose reactions were notably different from the Germans. Many of them had been exposed to American music before the war and responded with greater familiarity, some even tapping their feet or swaying to the rhythm. Tadeusz Kowalski approached the musicians during a pause. "You play St. Louis blues?" he asked Green. "I heard this in Warsaw before the war." Green looked surprised but pleased. "You know W.C. Handy? Man, that's something." He strummed a few chords, then launched into the requested song. Kowalski closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, a connection to a world that had existed before the horror of his recent years, a reminder that not everything beautiful had been destroyed. Nearby, Helga Müller watched her children as they listened to the strange music, their faces alight with curiosity and enjoyment. Friedrich was particularly entranced, his foot tapping unconsciously to the rhythm. "Mama, what kind of music is this?" Greta asked. "It's called jazz," Helga replied. "It comes from America." "I like it," Friedrich declared. "It sounds free." Helga considered her son's simple yet profound observation. There was something liberated about the music. Improvisational, unrestrained, emotional in a way that contrasted sharply with the rigid military marches that had dominated German culture under the Nazis. As she watched her children responding to the music, Helga found herself thinking about the black soldiers who played it, who had brought food to her hungry children, who had shown kindness where she had expected cruelty. How easily the human mind accepted lies when they came wrapped in the authority of government and reinforced by the crowd, and how powerful simple human interactions could be in exposing those lies. Colonel Brandt observed the musical gathering from the shadows of a nearby building, his expression dark with disapproval. To him, the scene represented everything that was wrong with the current situation. Germans fraternizing with the enemy, embracing the very culture they had been taught to despise, surrendering not just militarily, but culturally as well. He was not alone in his sentiments. A few other die-hard Nazi loyalists stood with him, muttering among themselves about the corruption they were witnessing. "This is how they conquer us completely," Brandt told his companions. "Not just with tanks and bombs, but with their music, their food, their false kindness. They make us forget who we are, who they are." "What can we do?" asked one of the men. "They have the weapons, the power." "For now," Brandt replied ominously, "but Germany has been defeated before and risen again. Our time will come." The others nodded, though without much conviction. The reality of their situation, a devastated country, a collapsed regime, an uncertain future under occupation, made such brave talk ring hollow. As the impromptu concert continued, Lieutenant Monroe joined Jackson in observing the proceedings. "Quite a scene," he commented. "Not what I expected when we rolled into town 2 days ago." "No, sir," Jackson agreed. "Though I'm not sure what I expected exactly." Monroe smiled slightly. "Probably not serving hamburgers and playing jazz for German civilians." "Definitely not that," Jackson chuckled. "Strange world, isn't it, sir?" "Getting stranger by the day," Monroe agreed, but maybe in a good way for once. The next morning brought a significant development. Division headquarters radioed that a journalist and photographer from Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, would be arriving in Schwartzburg to document the occupation and specifically the role of black troops in it. Lieutenant Monroe gathered his NCOs to brief them on the situation. "This could be good publicity for the 761st, he told them. "Heaven knows you boys deserve some recognition after what you've accomplished in this campaign." Staff Sergeant Jackson nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Yes, sir, though I'm not sure how much attention the folks back home want to give to black soldiers doing well." Monroe acknowledged this reality with a grimace. "Maybe this war will change some of that. It should anyway." By midday, the journalist, a Lieutenant David Cohen, and his photographer arrived in a jeep. Cohen was a sharp-featured man in his 30s who had been a reporter for the Chicago Tribune before the war. He approached his military assignment with the same professional intensity he had brought to civilian journalism. "Lieutenant Cohen," Monroe greeted him. "Welcome to Schwartzburg." "Lieutenant Monroe," Cohen replied with a brisk handshake. "I understand you've had an interesting situation here with the local population and your black troops." "You could say that," Monroe acknowledged. "I'll have Staff Sergeant Jackson show you around. He can give you the perspective you're looking for." Jackson was summoned and introductions made. Cohen studied the black NCO with professional interest. "Sergeant, I'm writing a piece about the 761st and the occupation duties you've been handling. I'd like to get your perspective on how the Germans have responded to black American soldiers." Jackson maintained a neutral expression. "Happy to help, sir. It's been educational for everyone involved." As they toured the town, Cohen observed the interactions between the black GIs and the German civilians. The initial terror that had greeted the Americans had largely dissipated, replaced by a cautious but increasingly comfortable coexistence. "It's remarkable," Cohen commented as they watched Private Green helping a group of German children organize a baseball game in a cleared area of the town square. "Just days ago, these people believed the worst propaganda about black Americans. Now they're letting you teach their kids baseball." "Food and medicine build trust pretty quickly," Jackson replied. "And children adapt faster than adults. They judge what they see, not what they've been told to see." The photographer, a corporal named Martinez, captured images throughout the tour. Black soldiers distributing rations, providing medical care, interacting with German children. The visual narrative was powerful, showing a reality that contradicted not only Nazi propaganda, but also many American preconceptions about race. One particularly striking moment came when they visited the makeshift clinic where Private Jenkins was working. They arrived just as he was treating a young German girl with a minor injury, her mother watching nearby with an expression of gratitude rather than the fear that might have been expected days earlier. "Has it been difficult?" Cohen asked Jenkins afterward. "Treating people who were taught to see you as inferior?" Jenkins considered the question carefully. "No more difficult than treating people back home who believe the same thing," he replied. "Medicine is medicine. Pain is pain. I do my job regardless of who the patient is or what they might think of me." Cohen nodded, making notes. "And have you seen attitudes change?" "Some," Jenkins acknowledged, "when people are sick or injured. They care more about whether you can help them than about the color of the hand that's helping. That's true anywhere." As they continued their tour, they came across Helga Müller and her children, who were receiving their daily ration allocation from Corporal Washington. Friedrich, spotting Staff Sergeant Jackson, waved enthusiastically, proudly displaying the small metal tank he still carried. Cohen observed this interaction with interest. "The boy seems quite comfortable with you," he commented to Jackson. "Kids are resilient," Jackson replied, "and honest. They respond to how you treat them, not to abstract ideas about race or nationality." The journalist nodded, then approached Helga. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Cohen with Stars and Stripes newspaper. May I ask you a few questions about your experience with the American troops?" Jackson translated, and Helga agreed hesitantly. Through Jackson's interpretation, she described the initial fear she and other townspeople had felt upon learning that black American soldiers were arriving, followed by the surprise and relief when they proved to be disciplined and even kind. "They gave food to my children when they were hungry," she said simply. "They brought medicine when people were sick. What else matters?" Cohen jotted down her words thoughtfully. "Would you mind if we took a photograph of you and your children with Sergeant Jackson and Corporal Washington? It would help show Americans back home how things are here." Again, Jackson translated. Helga hesitated, clearly considering the implications of being photographed with black American soldiers for a publication. "It's okay if you'd rather not," Jackson assured her, understanding her hesitation. But after a moment, Helga straightened her shoulders and nodded. "Yes," she said firmly. "Take the picture. People should see the truth, not lies." The photograph was arranged. Helga standing with her 3 children between Jackson and Washington, the American soldiers towering over the thin German family, but with expressions of respectful kindness rather than conquest. The moment captured something profound about the strange, unexpected connections being forged in the aftermath of a brutal war. As Cohen and Martinez continued their documentation throughout the day, their presence did not go unnoticed by Colonel Brandt and his diminishing circle of Nazi loyalists. From the window of his home, Brandt observed the photographer capturing images of black GIs interacting with German civilians. "Propaganda," he muttered bitterly. "Now they use our own people in their propaganda." Hans Weber, who had come to report on his mother's improving condition, stood nearby, uncertain how to respond. His own worldview had been undergoing a profound shift over the past few days, as the reality he observed increasingly contradicted the beliefs he had been raised with. "Is it propaganda if it's true?" he asked quietly. Brandt turned to him sharply. "What did you say?" Hans swallowed but held his ground. "The black medic saved my mother's life. That's not propaganda, that's what happened." "One act doesn't erase who they are," Brandt insisted. "What they represent." "And who are they?" Hans pressed, a new boldness in his voice. "Not what we were told. I've seen that with my own eyes, so have you." Brandt's face flushed with anger. "You're young, impressionable, easily swayed by a few kind gestures and some food." "Maybe," Hans acknowledged, "or maybe I'm just willing to see what's actually in front of me, instead of clinging to ideas that have led Germany to ruin." The older man stared at him, momentarily speechless at this challenge from a boy who had been one of his most devoted followers just days earlier. "My father died for those ideas," Hans continued, his voice catching slightly. "On the Eastern Front, he believed in the Führer, in German destiny, in the things you still believe. And what did it get him? What did it get any of us?" Brandt had no answer that would satisfy the boy, or perhaps in his most private thoughts himself. The evidence of Nazi Germany's catastrophic failure surrounded them: the destroyed buildings, the hungry children, the occupying army that was now feeding the very population it had been fighting. "Go," he said finally, turning away from Hans. "Your mother needs you." After Hans left, Brandt remained by the window, watching as the American journalist and photographer continued their documentation of Schwarzburg under occupation. Their presence represented something he hadn't fully anticipated: that the story of this defeat, this occupation, would be told to the world, preserved in images and words that would outlast the immediate reality. History, he realized with a hollow feeling, would not be kind to the cause he had devoted his life to. And the images being captured today, of German mothers gratefully accepting food from black American soldiers, of German children playing baseball under the guidance of men they had been taught to fear, those images would form part of that historical record. By evening, Cohen and Martinez had gathered sufficient material for their article. They joined the officers and NCOs for a meal in what had been established as the American mess hall. "This will make quite a story," Cohen commented to the assembled men. "Not just the military aspects, but the human elements. How quickly things have changed here." "War changes everything," Lieutenant Monroe replied, "though not always in the ways you expect." Cohen nodded thoughtfully. "I'm particularly interested in the experiences of your black troops, Sergeant Jackson, the contrast between how they're treated here versus back home." Jackson considered his response carefully. "It's complicated, sir. Here, we're Americans first, black second. Back home, it's often the reverse." "Do you think your experiences here will change things when you return?" Cohen pressed. Jackson exchanged glances with the other black soldiers present. "Some of us hope so," he said finally. "We're fighting for democracy abroad. Seems reasonable to expect some of it at home." Cohen jotted down this quote with a nod of approval. "I'll make sure that perspective comes through in the article." The following morning, the citizens of Schwarzburg awoke to an unexpected sight. During the night, someone had painted a crude Nazi swastika on the side of the American command post, the town hall. Beneath it were the German words, "Tod den Besatzern," death to the occupiers. Lieutenant Monroe was quickly on the scene, along with Staff Sergeant Jackson and a security detail. A small crowd of Germans had gathered, looking on with expressions ranging from embarrassment to concern. "Get this cleaned up immediately," Monroe ordered, "and I want a thorough search of the town. Whoever did this may be planning more than just vandalism." Mayor Werner arrived, clearly distressed by the incident. "Lieutenant, please accept my apologies. This does not represent the feelings of most people in Schwarzburg." "I understand that, Mayor," Monroe assured him, "but I need to know who is responsible. This kind of provocation can't be ignored." As German civilians were enlisted to help clean the graffiti, speculation ran through the town about who might have been responsible. Most suspicion fell on Colonel Brandt and his known Nazi sympathizers, though there was no direct evidence. Staff Sergeant Jackson supervised the cleanup, his expression grim. The incident served as a sobering reminder that despite the positive interactions of recent days, deep-seated ideologies and resentments remain just below the surface. Private Hill approached him, speaking in a low voice. "Some of the men are pretty worked up about this, Sarge. After everything we've done for these people." "Stay professional," Jackson instructed firmly. "This was probably one or two individuals, not the whole town. Don't let it erase the progress we've made." Hill nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Sergeant, just feels like a slap in the face is all." "I know," Jackson acknowledged, "but we didn't come here expecting gratitude. We came to do a job. That hasn't changed." The search of the town yielded no immediate suspects. Colonel Brandt, when questioned by American military police, expressed appropriate outrage at the vandalism while denying any knowledge of who might be responsible. With no concrete evidence, the Americans could not press the issue further. The incident, however, created a renewed tension in Schwartzburg. The easy interactions of previous days were tempered by a new wariness on both sides. Some German civilians, fearing American retaliation, became more reserved in their dealings with the soldiers. Some of the American troops, particularly the black GIs, who had been most directly insulted by the Nazi symbol, maintained a more guarded posture. Lieutenant Cohen, who had delayed his departure to cover this development, observed these changes with a journalist's eye. "This complicates your narrative," he commented to Jackson as they watched the last of the graffiti being scrubbed away. "Reality usually does," Jackson replied dryly. "Nothing's ever as simple as we want it to be." "True enough," Cohen agreed. "Though I still think the overall story here is a positive one. A few diehards can't erase what's happened between your men and most of these civilians." Jackson nodded, hoping the journalist was right, but remaining cautious in his optimism. That afternoon, an unexpected event further shifted the dynamics in Schwartzburg. A convoy of trucks arrived, bearing not military supplies but humanitarian aid from the International Red Cross. Among the aid workers was a German-American woman named Elisabeth Schmidt, who served as both a nurse and a translator. Schmidt, in her 40s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense manner, had emigrated from Germany to the United States in 1933, when Hitler came to power. She'd been working with the Red Cross throughout the European campaign, helping to address the humanitarian crisis that followed in the wake of combat operations. After introducing herself to Lieutenant Monroe and getting a briefing on the situation in Schwartzburg, Schmidt set about organizing the distribution of additional aid, clothing, medical supplies, and food for both the German civilians and the displaced persons. Her presence brought a new dynamic to the town. As a German-American, she could communicate fluently with the local population, while also understanding the American perspective. And as a civilian aid worker rather than a soldier, she represented a different kind of American presence, one focused solely on humanitarian concerns rather than military objectives. Staff Sergeant Jackson found himself working closely with Schmidt as they coordinated the distribution of aid. Her efficiency and directness impressed him, as did her lack of any visible discomfort working with black soldiers. "You seem comfortable working with my men," he commented, as they supervised the unloading of supplies. Schmidt gave him a wry smile. "I left Germany because of racism, Sergeant. I'm not about to embrace it from either side." "Fair enough," Jackson acknowledged, "though not everyone makes that connection." "People see what they want to see," Schmidt replied, "or what they've been taught to see. It takes effort to see clearly." As they worked, Schmidt shared some of her observations from other German towns that had been liberated or occupied by American forces. The patterns were similar: initial fear, based on Nazi propaganda, followed by surprise and gradual acceptance as the reality contradicted expectations. "The reactions to black American troops have been particularly interesting," she noted. "The propaganda about them was so extreme, so dehumanizing, that the contrast with reality is especially stark. In some ways, it's helping Germans confront the broader lies they were told. Jackson considered this. So we're accidentally helping with denazification by just being ourselves. Exactly, Schmidt nodded. Sometimes the most effective counter to propaganda isn't more propaganda. It's simply human truth. 3 days later, Colonel Brandt was found dead in his home, an apparent suicide. A handwritten note beside him read simply, "I cannot live in this new world." The news rippled through Schwarzburg, marking a symbolic end to an era. That evening, as rain fell softly on the war-torn town, Helga Müller stood in the doorway of what remained of her bakery, watching her children play with a group of American soldiers. Friedrich was explaining something to Private Washington, gesturing animatedly with the small metal tank still clutched in his hand. The soldier listened attentively, nodding and smiling despite the language barrier. "They will remember this," Elizabeth Schmidt said, appearing beside Helga. "Not the war, not the hunger, but this moment, when their world expanded beyond what they had been taught." Helga nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We believed such terrible lies. About them, about ourselves, about the world. How do we move forward from that?" Schmidt placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "One day at a time, one truth at a time." 1 week later, the 761st Tank Battalion received orders to move out, replaced by a regular occupation force. The departure was unexpectedly emotional for both the soldiers and the townspeople. German mothers brought what small tokens they could spare as gifts. Children cried as they said goodbye to soldiers who had become friends. Staff Sergeant Jackson knelt to say goodbye to Friedrich Müller, who was fighting back tears. "You be good, kid," he said, knowing the boy wouldn't understand his words but hoping he'd understand the sentiment. "Build a better Germany than the one we fought." Friedrich impulsively threw his arms around the soldier's neck. "Danke," he whispered, "for everything." As the tanks prepared to depart, Helga approached Jackson with a small package wrapped in paper. "For you," she said in halting English. "Remember Schwarzburg." Inside was a simple hand-carved wooden figure, a black soldier holding a child's hand. Jackson looked up, deeply moved by the gesture. "Thank you," he said softly. "I won't forget." The convoy pulled out as the townspeople waved goodbye. Lieutenant Cohen, capturing the scene for his article, asked Jackson for a final comment. "What do you think will come of all this, Sergeant? These connections you've made?" Jackson watched the receding figures of the German civilians, considering. "Hard to say, but these kids will grow up knowing that what they were told about people who looked like me wasn't true. Maybe that's enough to build something better." Years later, in 1965, a middle-aged Friedrich Müller, now an engineer in West Germany, saw a newspaper photo of civil rights marchers in Selma, Alabama. Among them, he recognized an older version of Staff Sergeant Jackson. That night, he showed his own children the small metal tank he still kept, and told them a story about hamburgers, Coca-Cola, and the day he learned that people are just people, regardless of their differences. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.